April 26, 1945, 3:15 a.m. The outskirts of Berlin, the Spandau district, Major Klaus Hartmann, 41 years old, commander of the 502nd Infantry Battalion, stood in a ravaged command post, staring intensely at the map before him. Outside, Soviet artillery shells lit up the sky in a deadly fireworks display. His phone rang. It was General Heinrici himself. The order was clear. All available troops and vehicles must immediately be redeployed to defend the government district. Civilians are not a priority. Hartmann slowly placed the receiver back on the cradle. Through the shattered window, he saw them, hundreds, thousands, old women with bundles on their backs, children clinging to their mothers' hands, wounded men supporting one another, all desperately trying to flee the city before the Red Army arrived. Hartmann knew what happened to civilians who fell into Soviet hands. He had read the reports, heard the eyewitness accounts. The screams still echoed in his mind. He had two options: obey orders and abandon these people to their fate, or risk his military career, his life, and the lives of his men to save them. He needed 3 seconds to decide. This is the story of the German commander who defied direct orders and saved over 1,000 civilians from certain death. Klaus Hartmann was born on March 3, 1904, in Munich, the son of Friedrich Hartmann, a high school history teacher, and Maria Hartmann, a nurse at the municipal hospital. The family lived in a small apartment in Schwabing, where young Klaus grew up, surrounded by books and the smell of disinfectant his mother brought home from work. His childhood was shaped by the values his parents instilled in him: duty, honor, but above all, humanity. His father, a veteran of World War I who had fought at Verdun, rarely spoke about the war. But one evening, when Klaus was 12 years old, he found his father weeping in his study, an old photograph in his hand. It showed a French soldier, young, no older than 20. Klaus asked, "Father, who is that?" Frederick looked at his son with red eyes. "That's the man I killed, the first one. I found his wallet. He had a wife, a baby. He was just like me. And I killed him because someone told me he was my enemy. Klaus, my son, listen to me. A man isn't measured by how well he follows orders, but by what he does when no one is watching. Promise me you'll always remain a human being, no matter what happens." Klaus promised. These words would define his life. In 1923, at 19, Hartmann joined the German army. He was no Nazi. He was not a fanatical ideologue. He was an old-school soldier who believed in discipline, professionalism, and the protection of his country. But he also believed in something that many of his comrades had forgotten: the protection of the innocent. In 1941, he fought on the Eastern Front. There, he saw things that changed him forever. He saw SS units burning down villages. He saw civilians shot simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He saw his own army, which he had once respected, become something he no longer recognized. In his diary, he wrote on August 12, 1941, "Today I saw us becoming what we are supposedly fighting against: barbarians, murderers. I'm ashamed to wear this uniform, but if I take it off, who will protect those who still need protection?" Hartmann made a rule for himself. He would do what he could, within the boundaries of his command, to protect civilian lives. In Russia, he refused orders to burn down villages. In France, he hid French civilians from SS raids. In Poland, he secretly organized food deliveries for refugees. He did it quietly, without fanfare, without recognition, because it was the right thing to do. Until April 1945, when Berlin was falling, and the biggest decision of his life arrived. The situation in Berlin in late April 1945 was apocalyptic. The Red Army had encircled the city since April 16th. 2 million Soviet soldiers, 6,000 tanks, 40,000 artillery pieces were bombarding the capital of the Third Reich non-stop. The German defense was in chaos. There were no longer any coherent front lines. Every city block was its own battle. Soldiers fought with their last ammunition. Hitler, hidden in his bunker, demanded fanatical resistance to the last man. Generals who wanted to retreat were shot as traitors. But the true victims were the civilians. Hundreds of thousands were still trapped in the city. Food was scarce. Water no longer flowed. There had been no electricity for days. Hospitals were overflowing with wounded. And everywhere, in every basement, every subway station, cowered, frightened people who knew that the Red Army was coming and that revenge would be taken for what Germany had done in Russia. Hartmann's battalion was stationed in Spandau, in the northwest of Berlin. His task was to defend the Havel bridges, to slow the Soviet advance from the north. But on April 26th, he received the order, move all troops to Central District. The government district must be held. The bridges are to be blown. No resources for civilian evacuations. Hartmann looked at his men. 72 exhausted soldiers, most under 20 years old, some over 50. He looked at the 14 trucks, 3 half-tracks, and 5 staff cars that were still available to his battalion. And then he looked at the civilians. They were streaming towards the bridges. Women, children, the elderly. They knew this was their last chance to escape the city before the Soviets cut off all escape routes. If Hartmann took his vehicles and drove to Central District, these people would die here. He called his officers together. Lieutenant Werner, Lieutenant Becker, Sergeant Major Müller, soldiers who had fought with him since 1943. He asked them, "What would you do?" Lieutenant Werner, 22 years old, answered first, "Sir, Major, if we don't follow these orders, we'll be shot." Sergeant Major Müller, 54, father of 4 children, said, "Sir, Major, I have 4 daughters. They're out there somewhere. If a German officer doesn't save them, I hope someone else does." That was all Hartmann needed to hear. He said, "Gentlemen, we have a new mission. We will get as many civilians across the Havel as possible. We will evacuate them westward, where the Americans are. And if General Heinrici wants to shoot me for it, then he can get in line, because the Red Army wants to do the same thing." His officers stared at him. Then Lieutenant Werner saluted. "Yes, Major." The others followed suit. The plan was simple, but life-threatening. Major Klaus Hartmann divided his forces into 3 groups. The first group, led by Lieutenant Becker, would defend the Havel bridges for as long as possible against the approaching Soviet troops. This might buy them 4-6 hours at most. The second group, led by Sergeant Major Müller, would organize the civilians, distribute them among the vehicles, and ensure that women, children, and the wounded were given priority. The third group, led by Hartmann himself, would escort the convoys westward through the contested territory, past Soviet lines, until they reached the American lines near Magdeburg, 130 kilometers, through war zone, with limited fuel, without air support, and with thousands of civilians counting on them. The operation began at 4 o'clock in the morning on April 26th. Sergeant Major Müller stood at the bridge with a megaphone. "All women with children, all wounded, to the front. We have limited space, no panic." The crowd shifted. Mothers pushed forward, clutching their babies tightly. Old men supported wounded soldiers. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, stood alone, crying. Her blue dress was torn and covered in dust. In her hand, she held a dirty rag doll. Hartman knelt beside her. "Where's your mother, sweetie?" The girl sobbed. She didn't wake up. The bomb came, and then everything was dark. And Mama didn't wake up anymore. And I called out, but she didn't answer. Tears streamed down her dusty cheeks, leaving clean streaks. Hartman felt his heart clench. He thought of his own daughter, whom he hadn't seen since 1943. He picked the girl up in his arms. "What's your name?" She whispered. Anna Müller." Hartman held her closer. "Anna, listen to me. You're coming with me, understand? I'm going to get you to safety. I promise you." The girl nodded, her face buried in his shoulder, her small fingers clutching his uniform. Next to Anna stood an old woman, maybe 70 years old, with a cane. Her name was Hildegard Weber. She had 4 sons. All 4 were dead. 1 fell in France. 1 froze to death in Russia. 1 was missing in Africa. 1 was burned in an air raid on Hamburg. She was alone. When Hartman saw her struggling to carry her small suitcase, he called out, "Private Schmidt, help this woman." The young soldier, 19 years old, from Leipzig, ran to Hildegard and took her suitcase. "Come on, Grandma. I'll take you to the truck." Hildegard looked at him with tearful eyes. "You remind me of my youngest son. He was just like you, young, polite." Schmidt smiled sadly. "He had a good mother then." Hildegard wept. Then there was the pregnant woman. Margaret Schneider, 27 years old, 9 months pregnant. Her husband was a soldier on the Eastern Front. She hadn't heard from him since February. She was alone with her 3 children, a boy of 5, Frederick, a girl of 3, Sophia, and a baby of 8 months, Peter. When Sergeant Major Müller saw her trying to carry the baby while Frederick and Sophia clung to her dress, he ran to her. "Mom, you can't walk like that. Come on, I'll take the children." Margaret, exhausted, hungry, frightened, burst into tears. "I can't anymore. I haven't eaten anything in 3 days. The baby cries all night. I don't know where my husband is. I don't know if we'll survive." Müller, who himself had 4 daughters, took the baby in one arm and lifted Sophia onto the other. "You will survive, I promise you. Come on now. We don't have much time." He took the family to one of the trucks and made sure they were seated in the front, where it was a little safer. Over the next 2 hours, Hartman's men loaded 280 civilians onto the vehicles. Women sat crammed together in the trucks. Children lay on blankets in the half-tracks. Wounded were strapped onto stretchers between the rows of seats. It was cramped, uncomfortable, and the vehicles were overloaded. But it worked. The first convoy set off at 6 o'clock in the morning. Hartman led in his staff car. Behind him, 5 trucks, 2 half-tracks, 30 soldiers as escort, and 280 people who were counting on him. The journey westward was a nightmare. The roads were blocked with burning debris. Soviet artillery bombarded any movement indiscriminately. Low-flying aircraft circled overhead. Twice they had to detour because Soviet armored spearheads had cut off the main roads. Near Falkensee, the last truck was hit by shrapnel fire. The tire burst. The vehicle skidded into a ditch. Hartman jumped out of his staff car and ran back. The driver was dead, struck through the window, but the 37 civilians in the back were unharmed, just frightened. Hartman roared, "Everyone out! Into the other vehicles, quick!" His men helped the civilians out, while Soviet shells exploded 200 meters away. An old woman fell. Lieutenant Werner picked her up and carried her to the next truck. A man with an amputated leg couldn't walk fast enough. Hartman threw him over his shoulder and ran. In 4 minutes, they had all been redistributed. The convoy continued on, leaving the destroyed truck behind. Near Nauen, a Soviet checkpoint stopped them. 3 soldiers, Kalashnikovs raised. "Halt!" Documents! Hartman got out, hands visible, but pistol in his belt. We have civilians, women and children. We just want to go west. Let us through. One of the Soviet soldiers, a sergeant, stepped closer. You're Germans. You burned our country, killed our families. Why should we let you through? Hartman looked him straight in the eye. Because you're human beings, not animals. You're not SS. You're soldiers, and soldiers don't kill children. The three Soviets looked at each other. The sergeant looked into the trucks. He saw the frightened faces of the women, the small hands clinging to their mothers. He stepped back. Go, quickly, before my officer comes. Hartman saluted. Thank you. The sergeant looked away. Don't thank me. Remember what war does to people. The convoy moved on. Around 2 p.m., they reached the American lines near Brandenburg. The U.S. soldiers were surprised to see a German officer with a convoy full of civilians. Hartman explained the situation. The Americans took in the civilians, offering food, water, medical care. The 280 people were safe. Hartman returned to Berlin immediately. Over the next 48 hours, Hartman repeated this journey 4 times. Each time he risked everything. Each time he lost men. Lieutenant Becker, 23 years old, from Berlin, a graduate of the Potsdam War School, was tasked with defending the Havel bridges. He knew it was a death sentence. His last words to Hartman before the first convoy departed were, "Sir, Major, if I don't return, tell my mother I was thinking of something good before I died." Hartman promised him. On April 27th, at 11 in the morning, as Hartman returned with the second convoy, he found Becker's bunker destroyed. A Soviet T-34 tank shell had scored a direct hit. Becker and 4 of his men were killed instantly, but they had held the bridge for 14 hours, 8 hours longer than planned. Hartman knelt beside Becker's body, closed his eyes, and whispered, "You did well, son. Your mother will be proud." The second convoy was even more dangerous. Hartman now had fewer men, fewer vehicles, and the Soviets were advancing faster. But he had 296 civilians who needed to be evacuated. Among them was a wounded soldier, Private First Class Kurt Neumann, who had lost both legs in an artillery strike. He lay on a stretcher, pale, weak, dying. When Hartman saw him, he asked, "Soldier, what's your name?" The man whispered, "Neumann, Sir Major, Kurt Neumann, from Dresden." "Hartman, you're badly wounded. We're getting you to the Americans. They have doctors." Neumann smiled weakly. "Sir Major, I won't make it, but these women, these children, they will. What you're doing is right." Neumann died an hour before reaching the American lines. Hartman covered him with a blanket and continued. The third convoy was attacked by Soviet Yak fighters. It was April 27th, in the afternoon. Hartman was leading 315 civilians, including 70 children. The planes came from the north, low, firing machine guns. Hartman shouted, "Everyone out, into the ditch, now!" The soldiers ripped open the doors of the trucks and helped the civilians out. Women jumped with their babies. Children ran screaming. Old Eleanor Weber, who had been in the first convoy and had now returned to get her sister, stumbled and fell. Private Schmidt, the young soldier from Leipzig, who had helped her in the first convoy, saw her fall. He ran back. As the fighters made their second run, he reached Eleanor, picked her up, started running. A bullet hit him in the back. He fell, but with his last breath, he threw Eleanor into the ditch. She survived. He died with a smile. Hartman found him later, covered him with his own jacket, and said, "You were a good soldier. Schmidt, you were a good man. That's worth more." 8 soldiers died in that attack. 2 trucks were destroyed. in flames. But all 315 civilians survived. By the fourth convoy, Hartmann's battalion was almost exhausted. He had only 29 soldiers left, 3 vehicles, almost no fuel. But 207 civilians were waiting at the Havel bridges. Among them was a 16-year-old boy, Martin Fischer, who was alone. His whole family was dead. He had nothing but the clothes he was wearing. When Hartmann saw him, he asked, "Son, how old are you?" Martin lied. 18. "Sir Major." Hartmann knew he was lying. "You're 16 at most. Get in. We're getting you out of here." Martin: "But I'm not important. Take the women, the children." Hartmann put a hand on his shoulder. "Son, every life is important. Now get in, before I make you." Martin got in. He survived. He later became a doctor. He worked in Munich for 40 years. He saved thousands of lives. All because Major Hartmann said, "Every life is important." On the second convoy, he rescued 296 civilians. On the third, 315. On the fourth, 207. In total, over those 48 hours, Major Klaus Hartmann and his battalion evacuated 1,238 civilians from Berlin, women who would otherwise have been raped and murdered, children who would otherwise have been orphaned or starved, old people who would otherwise have died in the rubble. But the cost was high. Of his 72 men, 19 died, 24 were wounded. All of his vehicles, except for 2 staff cars, were destroyed. And on April 28th, as the last convoy reached the American lines, the field police were waiting for Hartmann. A lieutenant colonel from the military police stepped forward. "Major Hartmann, you are under arrest for disobeying orders, desertion, and sabotage of military operations. You will be court-martialed." Hartmann said nothing. He saluted his men one last time, then allowed himself to be led away. Hartmann's court-martial was scheduled for May 2nd, 1945, but on May 2nd, Berlin surrendered. On May 7th, Germany surrendered. The court-martial never took place. The field police released Hartmann, and he became a prisoner of war of the Americans. He spent 2 years in a POW camp in France. There, he met an American officer, Captain Robert Meyer, who had heard of Hartmann's story. Meyer interviewed him. "Why did you do it, Major? You knew you could be shot." Hartmann replied, "Captain, I have been a soldier since 1923. I have followed orders I didn't like. I have seen things that shame me. But in the end, when a man dies, what matters? How many orders he followed, or how many lives he saved?" Meyer wrote down Hartmann's story. Later, it became part of the official U.S. military archives. Hartmann was released in August 1947. He returned to Munich with nothing but the clothes he was wearing and a small notebook in which he had written the names of all the rescued he could remember. His city was in ruins. The apartment where he had grown up had been destroyed. His father had died of pneumonia in 1943. His mother had died in an air raid on Munich in 1944, when an American bomb hit the hospital where she worked. His wife, Elizabeth, whom he had been married to since 1930, had died in an air raid in February 1945. Her body was never found. His 2 sons, Frederick, 19, and Peter, 17, were both missing on the Eastern Front. Frederick was last seen near Warsaw in January of 1945. Peter was last seen near Berlin in March of 1945. Neither was ever found. Hartmann was alone. He was 43 years old. He had no family, no home, no future. The first few months were the hardest. He found a small apartment in Schwabing, 2 rooms, cold, damp. He found work as a teacher at a makeshift school in a half-destroyed building. He taught history, just like his father had. The children were hungry, traumatized. Many had lost parents. Hartman understood them. At night, he dreamed of the evacuations. He saw Lieutenant Becker's face as he died. He saw Private Schmidt as he threw Hildegard Weber into the trench before the bullet hit him. He saw the small faces of the children in the trucks, terrified, clinging to their mothers. Sometimes he woke up screaming, sometimes he cried. But every morning he got up, shaved, put on his only jacket, and went to school. Because the children needed him. Because he had to live. Because he had promised to remain human. He never spoke about what he had done. If anyone asked what he did during the war, he simply said, "I did my job. Nothing special." It wasn't until 1963, 18 years after the war, that everything changed. It was a cold November day. Hartman was teaching a history lesson about the Weimar Republic when the school secretary knocked on his door. "Mr. Hartman, there's a woman here to see you." "She says it's urgent." Hartman went outside. In the hallway stood a woman, maybe 45 years old, well-dressed, with 3 adult children beside her. She looked at him, and her eyes filled with tears. She whispered, "Major Hartman." Hartman, confused, nodded. "Yes, but I'm not a major anymore. I'm just a teacher." The woman started to cry. "You don't remember me. That's understandable. There were so many. But I remember you. Every second. Every detail. My name is Margaret Schneider. I used to be Margaret Fisher in April of 1945. You were the German officer who evacuated me and my 3 children from Berlin. I was pregnant. In my 9th month. Sergeant Major Müller helped you." Margaret nodded vigorously. Yes, I was desperate, hungry, terrified. My husband was on the Eastern Front. I had 3 small children, no food, and no hope. And then you came. You and your men. You took us with you. You risked your lives, and you saved us. She pointed to the 3 adults beside her. "This is Hans, now 28. This is Sophie, now 26. And this is Peter, now 24. The children you saved. And this," she turned to a young man behind her, "is Thomas. He was born 2 weeks after you rescued us. With the Americans. In safety. Because of you." Hartman felt his knees weaken. He leaned against the wall. You all survived," Margaret wept. "Yes, because of you and my husband. He came back in 1947. He was a prisoner of war in Russia. We found each other again. We built a life. We have 7 grandchildren now. All because of you. How can I ever thank you?" Hartman, now 59 years old, grey and tired, with tears in his eyes, smiled. "Live well. Be happy. That's thanks enough." But Margaret shook her head. "No, that's not enough. You are a hero. And the world needs to know it." Margaret organized a meeting of survivors. She placed ads in newspapers across Germany. "Were you evacuated from Berlin by German soldiers in April 1945? Are you looking for Major Klaus Hartmann and the 502nd Battalion? Contact us." The response was overwhelming. 37 people at the first meeting, then 118 at the second, then 257 at the third. People came from all over Germany, from France, from America, from Brazil. They brought their children, their grandchildren. They brought photos, letters, memories. One woman, Helga Braun, who was evacuated as a 14-year-old, said, "I remember the major. He was tall, serious, but when he lifted me onto the truck, he smiled and said, 'Don't worry, little one, you'll see your parents again.' And I did." 3 months later, a man, Werner Krause, who was evacuated as a wounded soldier, said, "The major didn't just save civilians, he saved us, the wounded soldiers. He could have left us behind. We were useless, spent. But he said, "No man gets left behind. Not on my watch." In June of 1965, the memorial in Spandau was unveiled. It was a simple bronze plaque mounted on a granite block at the site where the old Havel bridges had stood. The inscription read, "To Major Klaus Hartmann and the 502nd Battalion of the German Army, who evacuated over 1,200 civilians from Berlin in April 1945, losing 19 soldiers in the process. They placed humanity above orders. They chose conscience over obedience. May we never forget that even in the darkest war, individual people can be a light." Over 300 people attended the unveiling. Hartmann, now 61, stood modestly at the edge. He didn't want to speak, but the crowd chanted his name, "Hartmann, Hartmann, Hartmann." Finally, he stepped forward. He looked at the faces, old women who were once young mothers, middle-aged men who were once children, young people who never knew the war, but lived because their grandfather was saved. Hartmann cleared his throat. "I don't know what to say. I'm not a hero. I was a soldier who made a decision. Many of my men died so that you could live. Lieutenant Becker, Private Schmidt, 8 others whose names I say every night before I sleep. They are the heroes, not me." Margaret Schneider stepped forward. "Major, you were our hero. You are our hero. And you will always be our hero." The crowd applauded. Hartmann wept. Hartmann died on March 12, 1978, 73 years old, in his small apartment in Munich. He died in his sleep, peacefully. His heart had simply stopped beating. At his funeral 3 days later, over 200 people attended. Margaret Schneider was there, now 60 years old. With her 4 children, 7 grandchildren, Martin Fischer, the boy Hartmann had saved who became a doctor, was there. Hildegard Weber, the old woman, had died in 1972, but her niece was there to represent her. Lieutenant Werner, Hartmann's officer who had survived the entire operation, was there, now 55 years old. Thomas Schneider gave a speech that no one who was there would ever forget. Major Klaus Hartmann never asked for glory. He never wanted a medal. He never wrote a book. He never spoke on television. He only wanted one thing: that we live, that we have our children, that we have a future. Today there are 200 people standing here who exist because one man said, "Not on my watch, not these people." My life, my children, my grandchildren, we all exist because this man chose correctly when it was the hardest thing to do. That is his legacy, and we will never forget it. A simple headstone marks Hartmann's grave. Klaus Hartmann, 1904 to 1978. Teacher, father, soldier. He saved lives when others looked away. Every April on the 26th, the anniversary of the first evacuation, people come to this grave. They lay flowers, they say thank you, and they tell their children the story of the major who put humanity above orders. The story of Major Klaus Hartmann is more than just the story of a soldier who disobeyed orders. It's the story of what it means to remain human when everything around you is inhuman. Hartmann was no saint. He fought for an army that did terrible things. He wore a uniform that was stained with blood. But in a moment when it mattered, when he had to choose between obedience and conscience, he chose correctly. Today, it is estimated that there are over 5,000 people who are descended from those 1,238 civilians that Hartmann saved, 5,000 lives that would not exist if a German major in April 1945 hadn't decided that human life was more important than military orders. In German military academies, Hartmann's case is now taught, As an example of moral courage, soldiers learn. Obeying orders is important, but there are things that are more important. In Israel, Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial, has documented Hartman's story. Even though he didn't save any Jewish people. Why? Because the director said, he represents something we must never forget, that even in the darkest army, in the darkest war, individual people can choose to be light. Hartman's diary, found by his family after his death, contains an entry from April 29, 1945, written in his cell while awaiting his court-martial. They will probably shoot me. Maybe I deserve it, for all the times I looked away, when I should have acted. But if I am shot, I will know that on this day, in those 48 hours, I did something good. I saved lives. And that's more than most men in this damned war can say. The little girl that Hartman took in his arms in the first convoy, whose mother died in a bombing raid, was adopted by an American family. Her name was Anna. She became a doctor. She died in 2018, 83 years old, in Boston. In her will, she left $1 million for a scholarship for German medical students with one condition. The scholarship must be named the Klaus Hartmann Memorial Scholarship. The man who saved her when she was 6 years old and alone would never be forgotten. If this story has touched you, if you believe that more people should know about men like Major Hartman, who showed humanity in the darkness of war, then support this channel with super thanks. Every bit of support helps us bring more forgotten stories, to honor more heroes who are ignored in history books. And please, write in the comments, should stories like these be taught in schools? Should we honor soldiers who broke orders to save lives? Your opinion matters. Write in the comments now. Major Klaus Hartmann saved 1,238 people, but his real salvation was something much greater. He saved the idea that even in the worst war, even in the darkest hour, a single man can decide to do what is right. And that is a lesson that should never die.